This is Vitae, a modern reimagining of one of modern Minecraft's most beloved magic mods of the past, Blood Magic. And it's now available for both 1.21 and the current Minecraft version 26.1.2. Vitae takes some of the same core progressional pillars of its predecessor, but adds a whole bunch of new and innovative features and mechanics, including powerful gear that evolves as you use it, extremely powerful rituals for automation, and the crown jewel, the Endless Dungeon, a procedurally generated labyrinth full of tons of valuable loot and even more custom and powerful enemies. Welcome back to Mod Labs, where we take mods and put them to the test by diving into new features, discovering new tips, tricks, and most importantly, having some fun along the way. In the next 25 minutes, we'll walk through everything Vitae has to offer by breaking down its progression path across 5 different sections, all leading to the Endless Dungeon. There's a ton of features to explore, and that dungeon definitely isn't going to get any easier, so let's get straight into it. If we're going to survive Vitae's dungeons, first we have some work to do, because almost everything in this mod, from magical tools, automation rituals, and even the portals to the dungeon themselves, are all powered by a resource called Sentient Vitae, or EV. Now, if you've played the original Blood Magic before, some of this is going to feel familiar, but Vitae has completely rebuilt the core progression of its mechanics, and everything starts with this one block. The Vitae is the heart of Vitae's progression. It's where we craft new components and eventually unlock each new branch of the mod. But before we can do any of that, we have one very important problem. The altar doesn't have any EV in it. So our first goal is crafting a blood orb. And this is one of the easiest things to miss when you're starting out. The Novitius Orb of Vitae should be the very first thing you craft, which is done pretty easily by right-clicking a diamond into the altar. Since the altar doesn't have any EV stored yet, it automatically starts drawing blood from nearby players to complete the recipe. It'll waste no time doing some damage to your player, but thankfully it won't actually unalive you. Once it's collected enough EV, you'll see this sweet new animation when the craft finishes, allowing us to take out our very first orb, which you can bind to your personal Anima network by shift right clicking. Binding a blood orb creates your connection to the Anima network, basically your personal storage of EV that's tied directly to your player. As that network grows, it follows you everywhere, across dimensions, through rituals, and eventually into the dungeons. Now that we have our orb, we can finally start generating EV ourselves. Right clicking with the orb converts a portion of our health into EV. Near an altar, that EV gets transferred directly into the altar. Away from the altar though, the orb stores it for later. It's a pretty simple system, although there is one small detail worth mentioning. Unlike the diamond previously, the orb does not care how much health you have left. And if you're not careful, or like me and not fully paying attention, then you could be in for a bad time. Now that we have a source of EV, progression starts opening up quickly, which means before long, we're gonna need a bigger altar. And this is one of my favorite quality of life improvements in Vitae. Instead of constantly having to check the internet and counting blocks by hand, the in-game guidebook can project a hologram showing exactly how the next altar tier should be built. When you open the guidebook and click on the eye icon, it'll show a hologram projection that can be anchored wherever you want by right-clicking. Then you can just place the blocks where the hologram tells you and you're good to go. And if you make any mistakes, the hologram won't hesitate to let you know by highlighting incorrect blocks in red. I'm really glad so many mods are starting to lean into these holograms whenever multi-block structures are involved. One thing I would definitely recommend is building your altar higher off the ground than you think you'll need. Later upgrades expand downward, and giving yourself some extra room now can save a lot of rebuilding later. Specifically, I would leave at least 6 blocks beneath the altar available for the future tiers. Another nice touch is that some of the placeholder blocks shown in the hologram aren't actually specific blocks at all. These bedrock-looking guide blocks can be replaced with whatever building block matches your base, which gives you a lot more freedom when designing around the altar. As we continue upgrading the Vitae, we're also given access to runes. Runes allow us to customize how the altar behaves. The nice thing about runes is that they let you specialize the altar towards whatever goal you're trying to accomplish. If you're crafting constantly, maybe you want faster recipes, and you could use speed runes. If you're running out of EV storage, then there are runes for that too. And if you're generating most of your EV through sacrifices, there are options to help with that as well. There are tons of runes already available that give all kinds of different abilities, and even more that I'm sure will be added in the future. So I won't take too much time to cover every single rune, but the in-game guidebook gives you a great explanation of each one if you're curious. Already one thing has become pretty clear though, and that's that the Vitae isn't meant to stay a simple crafting station. It really does become a part of your base infrastructure. And that's really the theme you'll continue to see throughout the rest of this video. Every upgrade supports the next upgrade, continuing to increase our Anima network, providing access to stronger tools and even more powerful rituals. And eventually, all of that progression leads us somewhere much more dangerous. Because now that we have a ton of EV, it's time to figure out how we're actually going to use it. With a growing Anima network, the first place most players will spend it on is Sigils. Sigils are magical tools powered directly by your Anima network. Rather than crafting consumable items, you're essentially unlocking new abilities that can be activated by right-clicking whenever you have enough EV to fuel them. There are a ton of different Sigils already available, and they generally fall into two different categories. The first are what I think of as actions. You activate them by right-clicking, and they perform a single action by spending some EV. The Divination Sigil is a good starting point, since it gives you information about your Anima network, and lets you inspect things like your Vitae and your EV reserves, which is definitely pretty useful, but maybe not quite as exciting as some of the others, like the Air Sigil, which literally flings you through the air in whatever direction you're facing, which does make it incredibly useful for exploration, and also incredibly dangerous if you're not being careful or don't have feather falling. The Blood Lamp Sigil is a little different and creates floating light sources wherever you need them. And later on, things like the Teleposition Sigil lets you instantly travel back to locations you prepared ahead of time, kind of similar to using /set home or the Waystone mod. The second category works a little differently. Instead of spending EV once, these sigils continuously drain your Anima network while they're active. Kind of like passive abilities that stay active as long as you keep them enabled, or run out of EV. The Phantom Bridge is a great example. As long as it's active, temporary platforms form beneath your feet wherever you walk, disappearing after a couple seconds. The Fast Miner Sigil grants haste while active, and the Magnetization Sigil constantly pulls nearby items towards you. As I've been playing, a lot of these sigils have become constant tools that are great to have at my disposal, but they do take up a whole lot of inventory space. Luckily, the Sigil of Holding lets you carry several different sigils inside a single item, making it much easier to swap between them on the fly. So now that we have a whole bunch of new abilities and a base understanding of EV, it's time to move on to the next major core resource of Vitae, Spiritus. And unlike EV, which comes from blood, Spiritus comes from combat, specifically early on through throwing daggers. These daggers are craftable weapons that you can throw with right click. There are a couple different types of daggers, and that actually leads to a fun little trick because each dagger tracks its cooldown independently, which means if you're carrying multiple dagger types on your hotbar, you can rotate between them and throw them super quick, bypassing that normal cooldown. It's a surprisingly fun combat style that definitely feels different from anything in vanilla Minecraft. And if your aim is anything like mine, then you'll be happy to know that missed daggers can simply be picked up and thrown again. Now, the daggers aren't just fun, but also extremely useful because every successful kill begins generating Spiritus. And pretty quickly, I ran into another important discovery. Spiritus doesn't stack, which means inventory management becomes a problem almost immediately. Thankfully, Spiritus gems are something you can craft that gives us a great way to store a large amount of it without filling every available inventory slot. And trust me, you're gonna want that storage, because Spiritus isn't just another crafting ingredient, it's the foundation of an entirely separate progression system. Meet the Hellfire Forge, our next major crafting workbench. Spiritus can be refined, converted into useful materials, used to create storage gems, and eventually becomes the resource that powers some of Vitae's most powerful equipment. And that means now we're basically juggling two separate resources, EV, which powers our abilities, and Spiritus, which powers progression. And now that we have both of Vitae's core resources working together, we can finally start investing in one of the mod's more unique progression systems. Vitae takes a slightly different approach to gear, because instead of simply crafting something stronger and moving on, instead you get equipment that continues to grow alongside the player using it. Using Spiritus collected through combat, the Hellfire Forge allows us to create sentient equipment, with full suites of the armor and tools that you would normally expect. But what makes these tools interesting is that they're not designed to be overpowered immediately. In fact, without Spiritus, most of them are only slightly better than their iron counterparts. But once they're fueled by Spiritus, that will quickly change. For example, the Sentient Pickaxe scales from a fairly ordinary mining tool into something capable of outperforming netherite entirely. Or the Sentient Axe, which doesn't just get faster at chopping down trees, but doubles as a surprisingly effective weapon once fully powered. And then there's something a little bit different, the Sentient Scythe. Unlike most weapons, the Scythe specializes in crowd control. While individual hits aren't quite as devastating, its swooping attack deals full damage to every enemy caught in its range, unlike a normal vanilla sword with sweeping edge, making it incredibly effective against large groups. And last but certainly not least is the Lex Vitae, which essentially combines everything together into one tool. Not just with the advantage of a multi-tool, but also the ability to change the block breaking radius by hitting shift and scrolling. The important thing isn't any individual tool though, it's the core mechanic behind them. Unlike many other mods, Vitae isn't asking us to constantly replace our equipment, and instead pushes you to invest in it. And that progression gets even deeper once you start working with Spiritus aspects. Up until now, we've been mostly treating Spiritus as a single resource. Spiritus. But not all Spiritus is the same. Vitae divides Spiritus into several different aspects, each one supporting a different style of progression. The default is Raw Spiritus, and that's fine for getting started, but eventually we're going to want access to some more specialized upgrade paths. We do have a bit of a problem though, because by default, Spiritus crystal farms only produce raw Spiritus. So how do you farm specialized aspects if you don't already have specialized aspects? The answer is Spiritus Catalysts. Each aspect has its own catalyst, allowing you to convert a raw Spiritus crystal into a completely different aspect and effectively kickstart that progression path. Once you've established your first crystal, the rest becomes much easier. You can begin generating that aspect directly and effectively build dedicated farms around whichever progression path that you're interested in pursuing. And I guess that's a good opportunity to take a closer look at the different available aspect types. First, there's Raw Spiritus, which is pretty much the fundamental aspect, offering a pure damage increase. Invictus focuses on resilience and survivability, still providing a moderate damage increase, but also triggers absorption for the player when used. Vindicta also provides a moderate damage increase, but also increases your attack speed and movement speed. Nihilium is basically the opposite, offering the greatest raw damage of any aspect, but at the cost of a reduced attack speed. And last but not least, Ruina, which provides the same damage increase as raw, but now also triggers poison or weather whenever an enemy is attacked. Of course, simply finding these different aspects isn't enough. To actually make use of them, we'll need to attune our equipment to the aspect that we want. The process itself is fairly straightforward. We can use a Vast Maleficum to infuse Spiritus gems with a specific aspect, and once we've collected enough of that aspect, our sentient equipment can be recalibrated to match it. So if I decided I wanted a tankier build, I could start investing in Invictus. If I want more damage, I can switch over to Nihilium instead, since your gear will always attune to whatever aspect you have the greatest amount of. What I like about this system is that it encourages experimentation. You're not permanently locking yourself into a single path the moment you craft your gear. Instead, your equipment can evolve alongside whatever build you're currently working towards. And once you started building that equipment, Vitae introduces what might be its most interesting progression system of all. Sentient armor doesn't just gain upgrades, it learns. Every action you perform while wearing the armor contributes towards different upgrade paths. Fight mobs and you'll begin unlocking combat-focused bonuses. Spend your time mining and you'll develop entirely different upgrades. Or even more general things like running around and exploring contribute towards shaping how the armor evolves. The result is a system where two players can start with the exact same set of armor and end up with a completely different build depending on how they're playing. One player might focus on combat, another might prioritize mobility, and someone else might invest heavily into resource gathering and utility. Which also means I'm pretty sure the community is going to come up with some absolutely ridiculous builds once people start experimenting with all these different systems. Which is great, because while stronger gear is important, Vitae doesn't expect us to stop there. Everything we've built so far has been preparing us for something much bigger. Because next we'll take a look at rituals, some of the most powerful structures in the entire mod. And more importantly, our first opportunity to check out the Demon Realm. Up until this point, most of Vitae's progression has focused on improving the player, but rituals take a slightly different approach. Instead of making us stronger directly, rituals are essentially the utility and automation engines with all kinds of different use cases. At the center of every ritual sits the Master Ritual Stone. Every ritual is built around this block, whether you're automating resources, granting yourself flight, or opening gateways into entirely different dimensions. Of course, before we can build any rituals, we're going to need to build its associated ritual structure. In general, rituals are made up of its Master Ritual Stone and a specified amount of Elemental Ritual Stones. And while you can craft the blank Ritual Stones normally, you can't actually craft the elemental versions directly, which means if you're searching through JEI trying to figure out where these things come from, you're probably going to be a little bit confused. Instead, Vitae gives us a set of elemental inscription tools. These tools allow us to convert blank ritual stones into their elemental variants simply by right-clicking and essentially infusing the desired element into them. Most rituals require specific elemental stones in specific positions, so this is a mechanic you'll be using constantly throughout progression. Although, one nice thing is that the inscription tools have infinite durability, so once you've crafted them, you'll never need to worry about replacing them. And thankfully, once you've got those ritual stones prepared, Vitae makes the actual setup process much easier. The Ritual Diviner is a wand that you can craft that opens this surprisingly nice GUI. Inside, you'll find every ritual, its description, and all of its requirements. Then once you've picked the ritual you want, simply right-click the Master Ritual Stone, and the Diviner will build the structure for you. Of course, assuming you have all the required materials, which is a huge improvement over trying to memorize dozens of different layouts. Then once assembled, you'll need an activation crystal bound to your Anima network to start the ritual. There are 2 tiers of crystals depending on the tier of your ritual, and this essentially kickstarts the process to start using EV to function, but also makes its associated effect active. Now there are a lot of rituals already available, and they generally fall into a handful of major categories. Let's start with combat and soul harvesting. Up to this point, we've had to manually sacrifice our own health just to generate EV, which clearly isn't sustainable. So of course, Vitae eventually gives us much more efficient options. The Well of Suffering harvests EV from nearby creatures automatically, turning mob farms into a powerful EV generator, which is admittedly a much better arrangement than repeatedly stabbing ourselves with a blood orb. And if EV wasn't enough, rituals can also automate Spiritus generation. The Ritual of Lost Souls watches for nearby mob deaths and converts them directly into raw Spiritus, helping support all of our sentient equipment progression that we looked at earlier. And then there's the Torment Nexus, which might be one of the most interesting rituals in the entire mod. Instead of actually spawning thousands of mobs, the Torment Nexus simply looks at nearby spawners, calculates what they would have produced, and gives you the resulting EV directly, which is obviously fantastic for server performance, although of course not something that I normally have to worry about with my server host Aklas. Which is a great segue to a reminder that if you're looking for a solid server host for Minecraft or all kinds of other games, don't forget to check out Aklas, where you can use code MCTC or the link in the description to get 20% off. The next major category focuses on automation and resource generation, because in true modded Minecraft fashion, the goal is always to do work to avoid doing other work, like gathering resources yourself. Some rituals handle simple jobs like harvesting and replanting crops, or even huge tree farms, but others are considerably more ambitious. The Endless Quarry slowly scans the world beneath it and extracts ores directly from the earth. And unlike most quarry systems, it continues working across huge distances and even unloaded chunks. Once again, super useful and powerful, but without absolutely tanking server performance. Then we have Crystallum Fractura. Remember all those Spiritus aspects from before? Well, this ritual helps automate crystal harvesting while also accelerating crystal growth and Spiritus production, making it essential for any type of late game infrastructure. However, some rituals aren't interested in automation at all, and instead have a very different focus. The world-shaping rituals are easily some of the most visually impressive in the mod. One ritual, the Dawn of the New Moon, can literally carve a massive section of terrain out of the world and suspend it in the sky, creating your own floating island. Another allows you to summon meteors from the skies, which contains a ridiculous amount of ores, but also takes an insane amount of EV. There are also rituals dedicated to upgrading or giving your player special abilities directly, whether it's granting flight with the Soaring Skies ritual, regeneration, movement bonuses, item collection, and other powerful effects to everyone within the ritual area. Many of these overlap with abilities that we've already seen through the Sigils, but rituals allow these effects to operate on a much larger scale. Vitae also includes rituals dedicated entirely to sentient armor, whether you're expanding an armor's upgrade capacity, extracting upgrades for reuse, or resetting a build entirely. These rituals ensure your character's progression remains flexible long into the late game. Now, don't get me wrong, these rituals are incredibly powerful, but they really aren't the ones that I'm the most interested in. Instead, I've been looking forward to something that is completely different. It doesn't automate resources, it doesn't give you special abilities, and it definitely doesn't make your life easier. Instead, it opens a doorway into the demon realm. One quick warning though, make sure you've got some room around the ritual before activating it, because the ritual creates a full entrance to the dungeon, voiding whatever blocks are in its way. And everything we've built or crafted up to this point has been preparing us for what lies on the other side of this portal. Welcome to the Demon Realm. And honestly, this wasn't quite what I expected. When I first heard about the Demon Realm, I immediately pictured some giant endgame dungeon trying to kill me the second I entered the portal. Instead, breaching the edge of Demon Realm gives us access to something called the Antechamber. And there's not a whole lot here. But luckily, this isn't really the final destination. It's where Vitae teaches you how the dungeon progression works before throwing you into the deep end. The basic idea is pretty simple. Every new room requires a key to open. And every time you open one, you're rolling the dice on discovering a room full of valuable loot or packed with mobs, or usually somewhere in between. One thing you'll quickly learn is to keep an eye out for spirit caches. They're basically the dungeon's treasure chests, and some of them are hidden well enough that you'll probably walk right past them the first time. In these caches, you'll find all kinds of different resources, from vanilla valuables, Vitae resources, gems, or special items from other mods, or even other keys. The Antechamber also remembers your progress, which was a pleasant surprise. You can leave whenever you want, restock supplies, repair equipment, and then return later to continue continue exactly where you left off. The rooms you've opened stay open, and the progress you've already made stays saved, which makes the entire system feel much more like a long-term adventure than a one-and-done dungeon run. Now, that being said, the antechamber is basically just the tutorial level, and you'll notice you'll hit dead ends in every direction pretty quickly. But the goal of this first dungeon isn't infinite exploration. Well, not yet. Instead, there should be one resource you're keeping an eye out for: Tau Fruit. What seems like just a random dungeon resource is actually the entire reason to head to the antechamber, and that's because Tau Fruit is what you'll need to craft bloodstone bricks. And bloodstone bricks are required to upgrade our altar once more to tier 3, which of course means that if you want access to stronger altar tiers, you're eventually going to need to venture into the demon realm and collect these materials for yourself. After upgrading to a tier 3 Vitae, we can now finally craft higher tier ritual components, like the Dusk Ritual Diviner, and that unlocks one of the most important rituals in the entire mod, the Highway to Hell. Now, if you're expecting this ritual to be expensive, you're right, because this ritual takes an insane 150,000 EV, which is a little bit ridiculous. And it's exactly why we spent this entire video building infrastructure instead of relying on manual resource generation. By this point, all of those systems finally start making sense together, all contributing towards a goal that would be almost impossible to reach by hand. And after finally gathering enough power, it was time to see what all this effort actually unlocked. Because while breaching the edge of the demon realm gives us access to the antechamber, Highway to Hell opens the Endless Dungeon. And Vitae immediately makes it clear that this is something different. The portal is larger and a little more intimidating than the one we started with. Well, here goes nothing. Once you're inside the Endless Dungeon, you'll notice some similarities to the antechamber, but now things are definitely a bit bigger and more detailed. But that's not the only thing that's changed, because keys have also become way more important than they were in the antechamber. Where the antechamber uses simple dungeon keys, the Endless Dungeon basically leaves those keys behind. From here on, progression depends on standard dungeon keys, and those can't be crafted. You have to find them in spirit caches while exploring, and that means you can only explore as far as the keys you manage to find along the way. Now, I won't spoil all the rooms, so you can have some of these same enjoyment discovering new ones like I did on my first playthrough. But trust me, there are a lot of different variations. Everything from libraries to blacksmiths, and even a broken end portal. But there is one thing to keep in mind as you open each door. The dungeon scales its challenge as you continue opening rooms, which means stronger enemies start appearing alongside increasingly valuable loot. The layout itself also becomes more complicated over time. Eventually, I started discovering stairways that led both upwards and downwards, turning the Endless Dungeon into a sprawling maze spread across multiple levels instead of a single chain of connected rooms. The demonium creatures are another highlight of the dungeon. The visual design work on these mobs is genuinely impressive, and every one of them feels distinct enough that you quickly learn to recognize which ones you're dealing with. Although, if I had to pick a least favorite, it would definitely be the demonium animaris. They're basically a supercharged version of a Vex, constantly flying around and somehow managing to appear at the worst possible moment, and are also basically impossible to hit. After spending some time in the dungeon, there are a few things I would strongly recommend. The first is, I definitely make sure you have some extremely strong gear, because while the first couple of rooms aren't too bad, that difficulty scaling is real. Whether it's a bunch of powerful sigils, or even some gear you've powered up using Apotheosis, it'll definitely get put to good use. Also, definitely bring more food and more storage than you think you'll need, because you're gonna need a lot of regen and even more space for all the loot you find along the way. But most importantly, if the dungeon starts talking to you, pay attention. After you go through a couple rooms, you'll get a warning message. At first, I assumed this was just there for like atmosphere, but I was wrong. That warning is basically the dungeon telling you that the mine layer is starting to open up. And from that point on, you'll want to pay much closer attention to the keys that you're finding. As you explore, you'll eventually find mine entrance keys. These are much rarer than the standard dungeon keys, but they open a very different kind of room. Instead of leading to another normal dungeon chamber, mine entrance keys open small mining rooms that are absolutely packed with special ores. These rooms are really one of the first times that the Endless Dungeon feels like it's paying you back for the risk. You spend a rare key and open a sealed mine entrance, and suddenly you're surrounded by demontine, dungeon ores, and resources that are incredibly valuable in the later game. But that's not all these mine entrance keys are useful for, because eventually after opening enough mine entrance rooms, you'll discover a much larger chamber, and once entering, you'll be met with the Foreman, the main boss of the Endless Dungeon. If the design looks familiar, that's because it's essentially an upgraded version of the Demonium Dolores. And just like the other Demonium mobs, the animations are really nice. But you won't have much time to admire them because this guy wastes no time attacking and has a pretty good chunk of health. And it's also probably at this point that if you didn't bring some good gear, you could be in trouble. The Foreman also spawns from a trial chamber, which means this isn't necessarily a one-time fight. Once the trial cooldown resets after about 30 minutes, you can come back and take him on again. And that's important because the Foreman drops the most valuable key type in the dungeon, mine dungeon keys. Unlike mine entrance keys, these can't be crafted. You can very rarely find them inside spirit caches in mine rooms, but realistically the Foreman is the main way you're gonna get them. And mine dungeon keys are used differently from the standard keys that we've been using so far. You can't just use them anywhere in the main dungeon. Instead, they're specifically used on dungeon seals inside the mine system. Behind those seals are entirely new mine-themed rooms. These rooms take everything the earlier mine entrances were doing and push it much further. The ore generation becomes more generous, the loot gets significantly better, and the mobs also become noticeably more challenging. It does kind of feel like a second infinite dungeon hidden inside the first one. And of course, the farther you go in the dungeon, the farther you have to backtrack to escape. Or hopefully you made one of those teleposition sigils from earlier to teleport straight out. And that's Neo Vitae. And while there's far more depth than we could possibly cover in a single video, hopefully this overview has given you a solid understanding of what Neo Vitae has to offer, and why it's quickly becoming one of the most ambitious modern Magic mods. The Endless Dungeon already feels surprisingly polished and content-rich, but the special part of Neo Vitae is that it still feels like a living project. So who knows what kind of new rooms, mobs, rituals, sigils, or entirely new systems could be added in the future. And as more players get a chance to start messing around with the mod maker is actively welcoming community feedback to help improve and guide the direction of Neo Vitae. So definitely let me know in the comments what your favorite part of the mod is, or what features you'd like to see added in the future. And if you want to provide more direct feedback, I'll have the issue tracker linked in the description. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to keep up with the latest Minecraft mods and mod packs, definitely consider subscribing so you don't miss the next Mod Labs episode. And of course, feel free to leave a comment with any mod suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.